Every servant at Blackthorn Manor had a list of things they knew to be absolutely true. The bread ovens ran hottest on Tuesdays, the East Corridor draught could snuff a candle from 10 paces, and the Duke of Theron had not laughed, not once, not even close, in exactly 11 years. Nobody alive in the household could say precisely what had stolen the warmth from him. Some whispered it was the death of his mother. Others said it was something darker, something he locked away the same year he dismissed the old household staff and sealed the West Library shut. Whatever the cause, the result was a man carved from silence. He moved through his estate like a stone figure brought reluctantly to life, commanding, sharp-eyed, and completely absent of joy. Gwendolyn Marsh had worked at Blackthorn for 9 weeks, which meant she had already broken a soup tureen, jammed a serving cart into the dining room doorframe, and once curtsied so hard during evening service that she knocked her own forehead against a sideboard. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, had tried to dismiss her twice. Both times, the Duke had simply said, "Leave her." No explanation, no warmth behind it either. Just 2 words and a return to whatever document held his attention. So Gwendolyn stayed, and the household learned to keep fragile things slightly out of her reach. On this particular Thursday morning, the great reception hall had been arranged for a meeting that carried the stiff air of formality. Lord Vane, a gentleman from Saltcliffe with sharp cheekbones and sharper cuffs, had arrived the previous evening with a letter of introduction and a claim of shared acquaintance with the Duke's late father. His manners were excellent, his boots were immaculate, and he had requested a private audience to discuss what he called a matter of mutual commercial interest. Duke Theron had agreed, though he trusted polished men about as far as he could throw a cathedral. The two sat across from each other in the reception hall, a grand room of dark oak paneling, tall arched windows, and a fireplace wide enough to roast a calf. Lord Vane spoke in smooth, practiced sentences about timber partnerships and coastal trade routes. The Duke listened with the patience of a man who had already decided this visitor was lying about something and was merely waiting to discover what. Between them, a low mahogany table held a silver tea service, and walking toward that table, carrying a freshly filled teapot of Earl Grey on a round tray, was Gwendolyn. She had rehearsed this in the kitchen, tray level, steps even, pour from the right. Mrs. Pemberton had watched her practice twice and then made the sign of the cross, which was not particularly encouraging. Gwendolyn made it 6 steps into the room before the velvet rug runner caught the toe of her left boot. What followed was the kind of disaster that unfolded slowly enough for everyone in the room to watch it happen, and fast enough that nobody could stop it. The tray tilted, the teapot slid. Gwendolyn lunged to catch it, which only redirected its arc with greater force. The silver pot sailed through the air in a wide, almost graceful curve, and struck Lord Vane squarely in the jaw. He recoiled with a sharp grunt, his chair tipping backward. His arms flew wide as he tried to catch his balance, and as his right sleeve snapped outward, something metallic clattered free from beneath his cuff and skittered across the flagstone floor. The room went silent. Lying on the cold stone, spinning gently to a stop, was a spring-loaded blade. A small, nasty thing, the kind designed to sit flat against the inner forearm and deploy with a flick of the wrist. It was not a gentleman's pocket knife. It was not a letter opener. It was an assassin's weapon, plain and unmistakable. Lord Vane's eyes dropped to the blade, then to the Duke, then to the door. Duke Theron looked at the weapon on the floor. He looked at Gwendolyn, who stood frozen in the middle of the room, still holding the now empty tray with both hands, her face white as milk. And then something happened that no one in Blackthorn Manor had witnessed in over a decade. The Duke laughed. It started low, almost like a cough. Then it broke open, a full, rich, booming sound that filled the high-ceilinged hall and echoed off the stone walls. He laughed the way a man laughs when the world hands him something so absurd that his body simply refuses to hold it in. A clumsy maid had done what his locked gates, his armed footmen, and his own constant vigilance had failed to do. She had exposed a criminal with a teapot. Lord Vane did not find it funny. He sprang from his overturned chair, but Theron was already on his feet. 2 sharp whistles brought the manor's footmen through both side doors, and within 30 seconds, Vane was pinned face down on the reception hall floor, with his wrists bound behind his back, using the very cord from the window drapes. Gwendolen still had not moved. The empty tray trembled faintly in her hands. "Miss Marsh," the Duke said, straightening his waistcoat. "Your Grace," she managed. Her voice came out approximately 1 octave higher than usual. "You may set the tray down." She looked at the tray as if she had forgotten it existed, then placed it carefully on the table. It wobbled. She steadied it. It wobbled again. She gave up and stepped back. The Duke studied her for a long moment. There was still a trace of that unfamiliar expression on his face, something between amusement and disbelief. "I believe," he said, "you have just saved my life with a teapot. I am so sorry about the rug, Your Grace." He almost laughed again. Almost. Instead, he turned to the nearest footman and issued 3 orders in quick succession. "Lock every gate. Seal the servant entrances. Send word to the stable master that no horse leaves the grounds until further notice." Then he looked down at Lord Vane, who was bleeding lightly from a split lip, courtesy of the Earl Grey, and said, "You and I are going to have a very different conversation now." He glanced once more at Gwendolen, who was quietly trying to pick up pieces of a shattered teacup without cutting her fingers. "And you," he added, "are coming with me." Gwendolen looked up, a shard of porcelain in each hand. "Me, Your Grace." You saw what fell from his sleeve. "You are now a witness." He paused. "Try not to break anything in the cellar." She swallowed hard, set down the porcelain pieces, and followed the Duke of Theron through the narrow corridor that led beneath Blackthorn Manor, into the cold, lamplit vaults where the real questions would begin. Behind them, the great hall sat in stunned silence. A tea-stained rug, an overturned chair, a concealed blade still lying on the flagstones, and somewhere deep in the old walls of Blackthorn, a laugh still seemed to echo, the first one heard there in 11 long years. The underground vaults of Blackthorn Manor had been built 2 centuries before the house above them. The ceilings were low and curved, lined with damp stone that glistened faintly in the lamplight. Oak wine casks sat in long rows along the walls, and the air carried the heavy smell of aged port and cold earth. It was the kind of place designed to store things people wanted to forget about for a long time. Lord Vane sat bound to a heavy chair in the widest chamber of the vault, his wrists tied behind the chair back with rope the footman had fetched from the stables. His earlier composure had returned. The split lip from the teapot had been dabbed with a cloth, and he sat with the calm, measured stillness of a man who had been in tight corners before. Duke Theron stood across from him, arms folded, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the stone wall. A single oil lamp hung from a ceiling hook between them. Gwendolen stood near the arched entrance, doing her best to look like she belonged in an underground interrogation chamber, and failing completely. She kept her hands clasped in front of her apron and tried to breathe quietly. "Your letter of introduction," Theron began, his voice low and steady, came from a Sir Alderton in Wiltshire. "I happen to know Sir Alderton died 14 months ago." Vane said nothing. "Which means you forged it, or someone forged it for you. Either way, you did not come here to discuss timber partnerships." Vane's eyes moved briefly toward Gwendolen, then back to the Duke. The maid should not be here. The maid is the reason you are sitting in that chair instead of standing over my body. She stays. Theron pulled a second chair from the corner and sat down, crossing one leg over the other as if they were having a fireside chat. Now, who sent you? Vane's mouth stayed shut. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. Theron studied him for a long moment, then turned to the footman standing guard by the door. Bring me his belongings. Everything he arrived with. Coat, traveling case, boots if you have to. The footman disappeared up the narrow stairs and returned a few minutes later carrying a leather valise, a dark wool overcoat, and the short-bladed weapon that had been recovered from the reception hall floor. He set them on an empty wine barrel. Theron went through the valise first. A change of shirt, a shaving kit, a folded map of the county roads with no markings. Nothing of interest. The coat was next. Theron checked every seam, every pocket, every fold of the lining. In the interior breast pocket, his fingers found something stiff. He pulled it free. A sealed leather pouch, no larger than a man's palm, held shut with a thin cord and stamped with a wax seal. Theron held it under the lamp. The wax was dark red, pressed with a crest that showed a lighthouse above two crossed anchors. "Saltcliffe," he said quietly. Gwendolen looked up. "Your Grace?" "This crest belongs to a trading guild in Saltcliffe, a coastal town south of here. Shipping, mostly. Wool and timber exports." He broke the seal and opened the pouch. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, covered on both sides with dense, cramped handwriting. He unfolded it carefully and held it toward the lamp. After a few seconds, his brow creased. "It's ciphered," he said. The letters on the page were arranged in tight blocks, groups of 5, separated by small dashes, with no readable words anywhere. At the bottom of the second side, beneath the last line of coded text, a second wax impression had been pressed directly into the paper. The same lighthouse and anchors. Theron held the page toward Vane. "What does it say?" Vane looked at the ceiling. "Who wrote it?" The ceiling again. Theron folded the letter and placed it inside his own coat pocket. He stood and walked a slow half-circle around the bound man, then stopped behind the chair. "You carried a concealed blade into my home," he said. "You used a dead man's name to gain entry. And you have a coded letter, sealed with a guild crest, from a town I have never had dealings with. Whatever your silence is protecting, I promise you it is not worth the weight of what I will bring down on it." Vane's expression did not change. His breathing stayed even. His fingers, however, moved behind the chair. Just slightly, just enough to shift position against the rope. Nobody noticed. "Your Grace." Gwendolen's voice was small, but Theron turned. She was looking at the shaving kit that had been pulled from the valise. "May I?" He gestured for her to go ahead. She opened the leather roll and examined the contents. A bone-handled razor, a square of soap wrapped in cloth, a small round mirror, and tucked beneath the mirror, a thin strip of paper with a string of numbers written in pencil. She held it up. "Could this be a key for the cipher?" Theron took it from her and compared the number string to the coded blocks on the letter. His eyes moved between the two for several seconds, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, or the beginning of it. "It could be," he said. "I will need time with this." He turned back toward Vane to say something further, and stopped. The chair was empty. The ropes lay in a loose coil on the stone floor. The knots had not been cut. They had been picked apart, slowly and precisely, by someone who had done it many times before. Near the base of the far wall, an iron drainage grate, bolted into the stone to channel rainwater from the hillside above, sat ajar on its hinges. A thin lockpick, the kind small enough to hide inside the lining of a boot heel, lay discarded on the wet stone beside it. Cold air poured through the opening. Beyond it, the sound of heavy rain echoed from the drainage channel that led out to the manor's eastern slope. Theron crossed the vault in 4 strides and crouched at the grate. The channel beyond was narrow, slick with moss, and pitch dark. Vane was already gone. He stood slowly, rain-damp air pulling at his collar, and looked back at Gwendolen. She stood holding the cipher key strip in one hand and the oil lamp in the other, her face caught between fear and something that looked almost like determination. "He's gone," Theron said. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at the empty chair, the discarded lockpick, the open grate, then at the coded letter in his hand, then at the strip of numbers Gwendolen had found. "He left us the only things that matter," Theron said. He folded both documents together and placed them inside his waistcoat. "Whatever that letter says, someone in Salt Cliff paid for my death, and now they will know the attempt failed." Gwendolen set the lamp down on the barrel. "What happens when they find out?" The Duke's expression had already returned to its usual stone mask, the laughter from the reception hall a distant memory. "They send someone better." The rain hammered against the hillside above them, and the open grate let in the sound of the storm like a long, low warning that settled into the bones of the old cellar walls. They had a dead man's letter, a string of numbers, and very little time. Theron gave the household staff exactly 40 minutes to secure the manor before he made his decision. Every window latch on the ground floor was checked twice. The footmen bolted the servant entrances from the inside and stationed themselves at the main corridors with heavy iron pokers from the kitchen hearths. Mrs. Pemberton, who had survived 30 years of domestic service without once losing her composure, gathered the younger maids into the upper parlor and locked the door behind them with a ring of brass keys. The Duke stood alone in his study on the first floor, the ciphered letter and the number strip spread flat on his writing desk beneath 2 candles. He had spent 20 minutes attempting a partial decode using the number sequence, substituting letters against the 5-character blocks, and he had managed to pull 3 readable words from the first line. Payment confirmed. Theron. He did not need to decode the rest to understand what he was holding. This was a contract. Someone had purchased his death, and the instruction had come sealed with the crest of a Salt Cliff trading guild. The cipher, the wax stamp, the careful routing through a man using a dead identity, all of it pointed to an operation built with patience and money. This was not a grudge finishing or a desperate act. It was organized, well-funded, and almost certainly not finished. Vane had escaped into the storm. By morning, word would reach whoever had sent him, and when it did, the next attempt would not arrive in a silk cravat carrying forged introductions. It would come fast and without politeness. Theron folded both documents into an oilskin pouch and tucked it inside his waistcoat. He pulled a heavy wool riding coat from the wardrobe behind his desk and buckled a leather belt over it. Then he crossed the corridor and knocked once on the housekeeper's parlor door. Mrs. Pemberton opened it with the expression of someone expecting the worst and prepared to manage it efficiently. "I am leaving the manor tonight," Theron told her. "I will be taking the Salt Cliff Road south toward the coast. I do not know how long I will be gone." "Alone, Your Grace?" "I am taking Miss Marsh with me." Mrs. Pemberton blinked. In 30 years, very few things had caused Mrs. Pemberton to blink. The girl who threw a teapot at your guest? The girl who uncovered the cipher key his shaving kit, and who can identify his face if we encounter his associates on the road. She is a witness, Mrs. Pemberton, and if she stays here when the next group arrives, she becomes a target. The housekeeper absorbed this with a single slow nod. "I will fetch her." Gwendolen appeared 4 minutes later, still in her day uniform, her face carrying the dazed look of someone who had been sitting in a locked room, trying to process the last 3 hours of her life. When Theron handed her a heavy traveling cloak lined with oiled canvas, she took it without a word and put it on. It was far too large for her. The hem dragged on the floor, and the shoulder seams hung halfway down her arms. "Can you ride?" Theron asked. "I grew up on a farm in Dorset, Your Grace. I can ride anything, with 4 legs and a saddle." "Good, there will not be a saddle." Her face went slightly pale, but she tightened the cloak around herself and followed him down the back staircase toward the stables. The stablemaster, a wiry man named Holt, who had served the estate since Theron's father was alive, already had 2 thoroughbreds bridled and waiting. He had heard the commotion from the reception hall earlier and had kept both horses ready since sundown without being asked. The man had good instincts. "The gray mare is steady on rough ground," Holt told Gwendolen as he helped her mount. "Keep your weight back on the downhills and give her the rein when she wants it. She knows the moor paths better than most men." Gwendolen settled onto the mare's bare back, gripping the mane with both hands and pressing her knees tight against the horse's sides. She looked terrified and completely committed to pretending she was not. Theron mounted the black gelding beside her. He leaned down toward Holt and spoke quietly. "If anyone comes to the gates asking for me, you tell them I left 2 days ago for London. You do not know the route I took. You do not know when I will return." Holt nodded once. "Ride safe, Your Grace." They walked the horses through the rear courtyard and out through the narrow service gate that opened onto a sheep track running north along the ridge. The main road lay to the south, but Theron kept them on the high ground, following the ridge line through thick gorse and bracken until the track curved westward and dropped into the wide moorland basin below. The fog was dense. Visibility dropped to 15 feet within minutes of leaving the ridge, and the only sounds were the soft thud of hooves on wet earth and the occasional distant bleating of hill sheep startled from sleep. They had been riding for perhaps 20 minutes when Gwendolen heard it first. Hoofbeats. Behind them, more than 2 horses, moving fast along the main road that ran parallel to the ridge below. She turned in her seat and looked back through the fog. Faint shapes moved along the lower track. Dark riders, 4 or 5 of them, heading toward the manor at a hard canter. The lead rider carried a shuttered lantern that swung in tight arcs as the horse pounded forward. "Your Grace," she whispered. "I hear them." Theron had already reined his horse to a stop. He watched the shapes pass below, counting the riders as they moved through a brief gap in the mist. 5. All mounted on dark horses, all riding toward Blackthorn. They were too late. The manor gates would be sealed by now, and Mrs. Pemberton would have every lock turned and every shutter barred. Holt would deliver the false story about London. The riders would find an empty chair and a cold trail. But they would also find the open drainage grate in the cellar, and they would know that Vane had been captured and questioned, which meant they would know the Duke had the letter. Theron nudged the gelding forward. "We keep moving. Stay close to me, and keep your voice low. The fog is thick enough to cover us, but sound carries on the moor." Gwendolen urged the gray mare alongside him, her fingers white against the mane. The cloak billowed behind her like a sail, and she had to keep pulling it forward to stop it catching on the gorse bushes. They rode on through the dark basin, the fog closing behind them like a curtain, sealing them off from the manor and the men who had come to finish what Lord Vane had started. Somewhere ahead, the moorland stretched for miles, open, treacherous, and completely without shelter, until the border way station on the far side of the county line. The Duke set his jaw and pointed the gelding south. Gwendolen followed. Behind them, the lanterns of the syndicate riders disappeared into the fog, swallowed whole, as if the moor itself had decided whose side it was on tonight. The moor at night was a living thing. It breathed through the fog in slow, damp exhales that clung to skin and cloth and saddle leather. The ground shifted between firm turf and soft peat, without warning, and every few hundred yards a stream cut across the path, shallow enough to wade, but deep enough to turn an ankle if a horse stepped wrong. Theron rode with the certainty of a man who had memorized this landscape as a boy. His father had taken him across these moors every autumn for the grouse season, and together they had walked every ridge, every sheep track, every crumbling dry stone wall that marked the old parish boundaries. He knew that the ground rose gently for the next half-mile before dropping into a narrow ravine carved by centuries of hill runoff, and that the ravine opened onto a network of ancient stone paths laid down by monks who had farmed this land long before any duke claimed it. Gwendolen knew none of this. She knew only that the gray mare beneath her was warm, the fog around her was cold, and somewhere behind them, in the darkness, were 5 men on fast horses who almost certainly did not want to discuss timber partnerships. They had been riding for close to an hour when the ground began to slope downward. The turf gave way to loose shale, and the horses picked their way carefully between jutting slabs of gray limestone that rose from the earth like broken teeth. "This is Blackwater Ravine," Theron said over his shoulder, keeping his voice just above a whisper. "The path narrows ahead, single file. Let the mare find her own footing." Gwendolen loosened the reins and let the horse choose her steps. The mare moved with the careful patience of an animal that understood loose rock, placing each hoof with deliberate precision. The ravine walls rose on either side, not high, perhaps 12 feet, but enough to channel the fog into a thick white corridor that made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. They followed the ravine floor for a quarter-mile before it opened into a wider basin. Here, the remains of the old monk's path appeared, flat stone slabs set into the peat, worn smooth by 5 centuries of foot traffic and weather. The stones were slick with moisture, but solid underfoot, and the horses moved faster on them. Theron stopped at a junction where the stone path split around a massive fallen boulder. He turned his head and listened. At first, nothing, just the drip of water off rock and the soft breathing of the horses. Then it came, distant but unmistakable, the rhythmic percussion of hooves on hard ground, echoing through the ravine behind them. The riders had found the moorland track. "They are in the ravine," Theron said, "a mile back, perhaps less." "How did they find us?" "They did not find us. They found the path. Any man with a lantern and half a brain can spot the entrance to Blackwater Ravine from the ridge. It is the only route south that avoids the open moor." He urged the gelding forward along the left fork of the stone path. This section climbed steeply through a scatter of old foundation walls, the remains of the monastic settlement, before leveling out on a broad shelf of moorland overlooking the basin below. They had gained perhaps 10 minutes, possibly less. Then the gray mare stumbled. It was a small thing, a slight catch in her front stride, a moment of hesitation, but Gwendolen felt it immediately. The horse took 2 more steps, and then stopped, lifting her right foreleg and holding it off the ground. Gwendolen dismounted and crouched beside the mare. Even in the poor light, she could feel it. The shoe on the right fore was gone, torn loose somewhere on the shale. The hoof beneath was intact, but tender on the cold stone. "She has thrown a shoe," Gwendolen said. Theron dismounted and knelt beside her. He ran his hand down the mare's leg and checked the hoof. The horse flinched, but did not pull away. "She cannot run on bare hoof over this ground. Not at speed. The stone will bruise her within a quarter-mile." Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew clearer. The riders were through the ravine now and moving along the stone path. A faint yellow glow flickered against the fog, the shuttered lantern, closer than before. Theron stood and looked around. They were on the shelf beside a crumbling stone archway, the remains of what had once been the monastery's main gate. To their left, a steep bank dropped into thick bracken and gorse. To their right, the path continued south across open moorland with no cover for half a mile. Running was finished. If they could not ride, they would have to disappear. "Take the mare behind the arch," Theron said. "Keep her quiet. If she nickers, hold her muzzle." Gwendolen led the mare through the broken archway and pressed herself against the far side of the standing wall, one hand on the horse's bridle and the other covering her own mouth to keep her breathing from carrying. Theron worked quickly. He pulled his heavy riding cloak from his shoulders and draped it across the mouth of the path, just beyond the archway, stretching it between two upright stones at chest height. Then he found a fallen branch, thick as a man's arm, roughly 6 feet long, wedged among the foundation rubble. He jammed it crosswise beneath the cloak, anchoring both ends against the stone walls on either side of the path, so that the whole arrangement formed a low, dark barrier that blended into the fog and the shadows of the ruin. It would not stop a horse, but a horse moving fast in poor visibility with a rider already straining to see through dense mist would shy at the sudden obstacle, and a shying horse on wet stone would throw its rider's balance long enough to cause hesitation, confusion, a few seconds of lost momentum. A few seconds was all Theron needed. He ducked behind the archway beside Gwendolen and pressed his back against the cold stone. The gelding stood motionless behind them, trained well enough to stay silent in the dark. The hoofbeats grew louder. The lantern glow brightened against the fog, casting long, shifting patterns across the old monastery walls. The first rider came around the bend at a canter. His horse saw the dark shape of the cloak barrier and planted its front hooves hard, skidding sideways on the wet stone. The rider cursed and hauled on the reins. The second horse collided with the first, and both animals scrambled for footing on the slick surface, their iron shoes sparking against the limestone. Shouts erupted. The lantern swung wildly and then dropped, clattering across the stone path and sputtering out in a puddle. The remaining riders pulled up hard, and for 30 seconds the shelf was a confusion of stamping hooves, raised voices, and horses snorting in protest. By the time the lead rider had calmed his mount and dismounted to inspect the obstruction, the fog behind the archway was already settling back into stillness. Theron and Gwendolen were gone, moving on foot through the thick bracken on the lower slope, leading both horses by their bridles, descending carefully toward the valley floor, where the ancient paths gave way to soft grass, and the sound of their passage was swallowed whole by the wet earth beneath them. The riders searched the shelf for another 10 minutes, before concluding their quarry had continued south along the main path. They remounted and rode hard in that direction, chasing a trail that no longer existed. The moor kept its silence, the fog kept its secrets, and somewhere below the ridge, 2 figures and 2 horses moved slowly through the dark, heading for the border. They walked through the remainder of the night. The bracken slope gave way to a cattle track that wound along the bottom of a shallow valley, following a stream that ran clear and cold over smooth pebbles. Theron kept them on the soft grass beside the track, rather than on the track itself, where hoofprints in the mud would mark their passage as clearly as a written invitation. Gwendolen said very little during those hours. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, keeping a steady grip on the gray mare's bridle, and staying close enough to the Duke's outline in the fog that she would not lose him entirely. Her boots were soaked through. The oversized traveling cloak dragged behind her like a wet curtain, collecting burrs and mud with every step. Twice she stumbled on hidden rabbit holes and caught herself against the mare's shoulder. The Duke did not stumble once. He moved through the dark valley with the same quiet authority he carried through the corridors of Blackthorn Manor, as though the landscape itself understood it was supposed to cooperate with him. Dawn arrived slowly, the fog thinning from white to gray to a pale, watery blue, as the sun fought its way above the eastern hills. With the light came visibility, and with visibility came the first sign of civilization they had seen since leaving the manor. A thin column of chimney smoke, rising from behind a stand of elm trees on the far side of a stone bridge. The Wayfarer's Rest was the kind of establishment that existed because geography demanded it. Positioned at the crossing of two county roads near the border of three parishes, it served as coaching inn, post station, and informal marketplace for the scattered farming communities in every direction. The building itself was old, timber-framed, with a sagging thatched roof and whitewashed walls that had gone gray with age and weather. A painted wooden sign above the door showed a man in a broad hat resting beneath a tree, the colors faded to ghosts of their original brightness. Theron stopped at the edge of the elm grove and studied the inn from a distance. Two coaches stood in the yard, a private brougham with mud-caked wheels and a larger public stage that appeared to be waiting for a change of horses. A handful of travelers moved around the yard, stretching their legs and smoking clay pipes. "We go in separately," Theron said. "I will enter first and arrange a private parlor upstairs. You follow 5 minutes later through the kitchen entrance. If anyone asks, you are a merchant's clerk, traveling to meet your employer on the coast. And you, Your Grace? A wool buyer from the North Counties." Theron is not a name anyone would recognize this far from the estate, but the face of a duke draws questions I would rather not answer. He removed his riding coat and turned it inside out, showing the plain linen lining rather than the tailored wool exterior. He pulled a flat cap from the saddlebag and tucked it low over his forehead. The transformation was surprisingly effective. Without the upright posture of a gentleman's coat and the polished boots, which were now thoroughly muddied anyway, he could pass for any moderately prosperous tradesman on the road. Gwendolen watched this with the expression of someone making mental notes for future reference. "Should I do anything with my appearance? You look like a woman who has walked across a moor all night. That is disguise enough. No one asks questions of someone who looks that exhausted." She could not argue with this. Theron left the horses tied in the elm grove and crossed the bridge on foot. He entered the inn through the front door and was inside for 6 minutes before Gwendolen followed through the rear kitchen entrance, passing through a warm cloud of bread and bacon smell that nearly made her knees buckle after a night of walking on nothing but cold air and determination. A kitchen boy pointed her toward the back stairs without much interest, and she climbed to the first floor, where Theron had secured a small private parlor at the end of the corridor. The room held a round table, 2 chairs, a narrow daybed pushed against the wall, and a coal fire that had been lit recently and was still catching. The single window overlooked the inn yard below. Theron had already ordered breakfast: cold ham, bread, a pot of strong tea, and a wedge of hard cheese that looked old enough to have opinions. Gwendolen sat down and ate with the kind of focused silence that suggested conversation could wait until the plate was empty. When she had finished, Theron spread the ciphered letter and the number strip on the table. "I managed a partial decode on the road," he said. "The number sequence corresponds to page and line references, likely from a common book used as a key. Without the book, full translation is slow, but the structure confirms what I suspected. This letter contains financial instructions, amounts, names, delivery points." Gwendolen leaned forward, studying the cramped handwriting. "The wax seal, the lighthouse and anchors. You said it was a Saltcliffe Trading Guild?" "The Saltcliffe Harbor Merchants Guild. They control most of the shipping through the southern ports. Wool, grain, timber." He tapped the crest impression at the bottom of the letter. This seal means the letter was either sent by someone inside that guild or meant to appear as though it was. A creak on the stairs made them both look toward the door. Footsteps passed along the corridor and faded into another room. Theron waited a full 30 seconds before continuing. We need to identify who within that guild authorized this. The letter alone is evidence of a conspiracy, but without a name attached to the commission, it proves nothing in front of a magistrate. Gwendolyn nodded slowly, then stood and walked to the window. The inn-yard below was busy now. The public stage was loading passengers, a groom was leading a pair of fresh horses from the stable block, and several travelers milled around the mounting steps. She watched the yard with the same sharp eye that had spotted the number strip in the shaving kit. It was an instinct she had carried from past. Her father had been a tenant farmer who kept meticulous records of every bushel and bale, and he had taught her to notice when numbers did not add up and when details did not match. Something in the yard caught her attention. A man stood near the Brockham, speaking with the driver. He was dressed in a long brown coat with a fur-trimmed collar, and he held a leather document case under one arm. Prosperous-looking, well-fed, nothing unusual about him at a glance, except for his right hand. On the third finger, he wore a heavy signet ring, and even from the first-floor window, through the slightly warped glass, Gwendolyn could see the device stamped into the metal, a lighthouse, above two crossed anchors. Her breath caught. She turned from the window and looked at Theron with an expression that had lost every trace of exhaustion. "Your Grace," she said quietly. "There is a man in the yard wearing the same crest." Theron was at the window in 2 strides. He stood to the side, keeping his body behind the curtain, and looked down at the man by the brougham. His jaw tightened. "He is heading for the stables." Gwendolyn was already reaching for her cloak. "Then so am I." Theron caught her arm before she reached the door. "You are not walking into a stable yard to search the belongings of a man connected to the people who tried to end me. That is precisely the kind of thing that gets a person found in a ditch 3 days later." Gwendolyn turned back. "He is leaving, Your Grace. If he takes that Brockham out of the yard, whatever he is carrying goes with him. We have a coded letter and a partial key. If there is anything in his bags that connects the guild to the contract on your life, it is sitting in that stable right now, and it will not be sitting there for long." Theron held her gaze for a moment. She was right, and they both knew it. The Duke was too recognizable even in his tradesman disguise to spend time crouching around saddlebags in a public coaching yard. Gwendolyn, on the other hand, was a young woman in a mud-stained traveling cloak who looked like every other exhausted servant passing through a border way station. Nobody would look at her twice. He released her arm. "His horse will be in the private stalls on the far side of the stable block, the ones with the half doors. Coaching inns keep paying guests' mounts separate from the stage horses. I know. I grew up around stables. You grew up around farm horses. This is different. If he comes back while you are in there, you are a lost traveler looking for your employer's mare. Nothing more. I can manage that." Gwendolyn, his voice carried a weight that stopped her with one hand on the door latch. "If anything feels wrong, a voice, a footstep, a shadow in the wrong place, you leave. Immediately. Whatever is in that saddlebag is not worth your life." She met his eyes. There was something in his expression she had not seen before, a tightness around the jaw that went beyond tactical calculation. It was brief, and he masked it quickly, but she caught it. "I will be careful, Your Grace." She slipped out of the parlor and descended the back stairs to the kitchen. The cook and the kitchen boy were occupied with the midday preparation, a large pot of something involving turnips and mutton bones, and neither looked up as she passed through and out the rear door into the yard. The stable block sat across the cobbled yard from the main building, a long timber structure with a pitched slate roof and a row of small windows along the upper hayloft. The main doors stood open, and the warm smell of hay and horse sweat drifted out into the cool afternoon air. Inside, the stage horses were being rubbed down by 2 grooms who worked with the hurried efficiency of men who did this 12 times a day. Gwendolen walked past them without pausing, keeping her stride purposeful and unremarkable. A woman who hesitated in a stable yard drew attention. A woman who walked as though she had somewhere to be did not. The private stalls were around the far corner of the building, separated from the main block by a tack room hung with bridles and spare harness. 4 stalls with half-doors lined the back wall, and 3 of them were occupied. A chestnut hunter, a dappled cob, and a tall bay gelding with a clipped mane and a saddle rack beside its stall, holding a gentleman's riding saddle with brass fittings. The bay matched the bruvame. This was the ring-wearer's horse. Gwendolen checked the yard through the tack-room doorway. The man in the brown coat was still visible near the front of the inn, now speaking with a second traveler over a shared clay pipe. He was in no hurry. She had a few minutes. She opened the half-door of the bay's stall and stepped inside. The horse shifted its weight and turned one ear toward her, but did not startle. She ran a hand along its neck to settle it, then turned her attention to the saddlebag hanging from a hook on the stall partition. It was good leather, well made, with brass buckles and a monogram stamped into the flap. The initials, R.H. She unbuckled the main compartment and reached inside. A folded shirt, a tin of boot polish, a small leather-bound notebook filled with columns of figures that appeared to be shipping manifests, tonnage, dates, port names. She flipped through the pages quickly, scanning for anything that stood out. Midway through the notebook, a loose sheet of paper had been tucked between the pages. She pulled it free and unfolded it. It was a financial draft, a written order of payment drawn on the Salt Cliff Harbor Merchants Guild, authorizing the transfer of £400 to an unnamed recipient through a trading house in the port city of Oakhaven Bay. The draft was dated 3 weeks prior to Lord Vane's arrival at Blackthorn Manor. At the bottom, beside the guild's printed stamp, a handwritten notation read, "Final settlement upon confirmed completion." Gwendolen's hands went still. Final settlement upon confirmed completion. £400 was a fortune, more than a skilled tradesman earned in 10 years, and the language was unmistakable. This was not a shipping invoice or a trade payment. This was the second half of a contract fee, payable on proof that the job had been done, proof that Duke Theron was gone. She turned the draft over. On the back, in the same handwriting as the notation, someone had written a name and address: Crane and Harwick, Chandler's, Wharf Street, Oakhaven Bay. A business, a receiving point, the place where this draft was meant to be cashed once Lord Vane returned from Blackthorn with blood on his hands. She folded the draft carefully and slipped it inside her bodice, flat against her ribs where it would not shift or crinkle. Then she returned the notebook to the saddlebag, rebuckled the flap, and stepped out of the stall. The bay gelding watched her leave with the mild indifference of an animal that had seen far stranger things happen in coaching inn stables. She crossed the tack room and paused at the doorway. The yard was clear. The grooms were inside with the stage horses. The man in the brown coat had moved from the front of the inn and was now walking, slowly, unhurried, back toward the stable block. Gwendolen turned left instead of right, circled the far end of the building, crossed behind the coach house, and re-entered the inn through the kitchen door. The cook glanced up this time but said nothing. A woman coming in from the yard was even less interesting than a woman going out. She climbed the back stairs 2 at a time and pushed open the parlor door. Theron was standing at the window. He turned as she entered, and his eyes dropped immediately to her face, reading it the way he read documents. Quickly, thoroughly, missing nothing. "You found something." Gwendolen reached inside her cloak and produced the folded draft. She placed it on the table beside the ciphered letter. £400, she said, drawn on the Saltcliffe Guild, payable through a chandler's office in Oakhaven Bay upon confirmed completion of the contract. Theron picked up the draft and read it in silence. His expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened and released twice before he set the paper down. Crane and Harwick, he said quietly. Oakhaven Bay. That is where the money was meant to go after you were finished. He looked at her. Then that is where we are going. They left the Wayfarer's Rest within the hour. Theron paid for a private closed carriage from the inn's hiring yard. A sturdy four-wheeled brougham with a canvas roof and leather curtains that could be drawn across the windows. The vehicle was old and smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool, but the axles were greased, the springs were sound, and the pair of draft horses hitched to the front were broad-chested and fresh. The inn's ostler arranged a driver as part of the hire, a thick-necked man named Calder who wore a battered coachman's cape and said very little beyond confirming the route. Theron instructed him to take the coastal highway south toward Oakhaven Bay, a journey of roughly 8 hours if the roads held and the weather stayed dry. Gwendolen climbed into the carriage first and settled onto the worn bench seat, with the traveling cloak folded beneath her as a cushion. Theron followed, pulling the leather curtain across the window on the yard side before the carriage rolled out through the inn gate and turned onto the main road. For the first 2 hours, the journey was uneventful. The coastal highway ran along the spine of a chalk ridge that offered broad views of the surrounding farmland. Patchwork fields of barley and rape, stone-walled paddocks dotted with sheep, and the occasional hamlet clustered around a church spire. The road surface was packed earth and gravel, well maintained by the Turnpike Trust, and the carriage moved at a steady trot that covered ground without punishing the springs. Theron used the time to work on the cipher. He had the coded letter spread on his knee, the number strip beside it, and a pencil stub he had taken from the inn's writing desk. The partial decode from the previous night had given him a method. The numbers referred to positions within a substitution alphabet that shifted every third block, and now, with better light and a flat surface, he was making progress. Gwendolen sat across from him and watched the countryside through a gap in the curtain. She had not slept in nearly 30 hours, and her body had moved past exhaustion into a strange, brittle alertness, where everything seemed slightly too sharp and slightly too bright. "Your Grace," she said after a while, "may I ask something?" Theron did not look up from the cipher. "You may. You have not laughed in 11 years. Everyone at Blackthorn knows this. Mrs. Pemberton told me on my first day as though she were warning me about a leaking roof." She paused. "What happened 11 years ago?" The pencil stopped moving. Theron stared at the coded letter for a long moment, then folded it and placed it inside his coat. "My mother died," he said. "She was ill for a long time, and when she finally passed, I discovered that someone in my household, someone I trusted, had been slowly draining the estate's accounts during her illness, taking advantage of my absence while I sat at her bedside." He looked out through the gap in the curtain. "I never found proof of who it was. I dismissed the entire senior staff and closed the parts of the house I could not bear to walk through. After that, I suppose there was very little to laugh about." Gwendolen was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry, Your Grace." "Do not be sorry. Be observant. You have a talent for noticing things that do not belong, Miss Marsh. A number strip in a shaving kit, a signet ring in a crowded yard. That instinct is worth more to me right now than sympathy." She accepted this with a small nod and returned her attention to the window. The road had begun to descend from the chalk ridge toward the coast. The landscape changed. The open farmland gave way to dense woodland on both sides, and the gravel surface narrowed as the highway cut through a series of steep switchbacks carved into the hillside. To the left, the ground dropped sharply into a wooded ravine. To the right, a moss-covered limestone cliff rose above the tree line. It was on the third switchback that Gwendolyn felt the carriage change direction. The shift was subtle at first, a slight leftward pull, as though the horses had drifted toward the edge of the road. Then it became deliberate. The carriage swung wider on the next curve, the left wheels rolling within a foot of the ravine edge, and the pace increased sharply. The horses were being driven faster than the terrain allowed. Theron felt it at the same moment. He pulled the front curtain aside and looked through the narrow opening into the driver's box. Calder sat hunched on the bench, his whip arm working the horses into a hard canter. His posture had changed, the relaxed slouch of a hired coachman replaced by a rigid, purposeful hunch. And as the carriage swung through the next turn, he pulled the reins sharply to the left, steering the front wheels directly toward the crumbling edge of the hillside trail. "He is taking us over," Theron said. There was no time for a plan. Theron shoved the front curtain fully aside, gripped the edges of the narrow window frame, and hauled himself through the opening head-first onto the driver's box. The carriage lurched as his weight shifted, and the left rear wheel clipped a boundary stone with a crack that sent splinters of rock into the ravine below. Calder turned and swung a fist. It caught Theron on the shoulder, but the Duke had already planted his knee against the footboard and drove his full weight forward into the man's chest. They grappled on the narrow bench, the reins tangling between them as the horses charged blindly along the narrowing road. Inside the carriage, Gwendolyn was thrown sideways against the door as the vehicle tilted on the curve. She caught herself on the window frame and looked down. The left wheels were running along the very lip of the ravine, and loose earth was crumbling away beneath them with every rotation. She looked around the carriage interior. Beneath the opposite bench, bolted to a brass fitting, was a carriage lamp, a heavy brass cylinder with a glass shield, designed to be hung outside the door for night travel. She wrenched it free from its bracket, leaned out of the window, and looked at the front wheel assembly. The steering mechanism connected to the front axle through a pair of iron linkages that passed beneath the driver's box. If the wheels could not turn, the carriage would track straight, regardless of what the driver did with the reins. She reached down as far as her arm would extend and jammed the brass lamp lengthwise into the gap between the left linkage arm and the axle housing. The metal caught and held, locking the steering assembly at its current angle. The effect was immediate. The front wheels seized into a fixed forward position, and the carriage stopped responding to the reins. The horses, confused by the sudden resistance, broke from their canter into a stumbling trot. The vehicle slowed, skidded sideways across the wet gravel, and plowed into a muddy drainage ditch on the right side of the road with a heavy, jarring thud that threw everyone forward. The carriage came to rest at a sharp angle, one wheel in the ditch and the other spinning freely above the road surface. The horses stood heaving in their harness, foam on their necks and wild confusion in their eyes. On the driver's box, Theron had Calder pinned against the footboard with one arm across his throat. The man had stopped struggling. His coachman's cape had torn open during the fight, revealing a leather cord around his neck, from which hung a small brass token stamped with a familiar symbol, a lighthouse above two crossed anchors. Theron pulled the token free and held it in front of the man's face. "How many of you are on this road?" Calder spat to the side and said nothing. Theron pocketed the token, bound the man's wrists with his own belt, and climbed down from the listing carriage. He found Gwendolyn standing in the ditch beside the rear wheel, mud up to her ankles, the oversized cloak hanging off one shoulder and her hair falling loose from its pins. "The lamp worked," she said. He looked at the brass cylinder jammed into the steering assembly, then at her, and something close to admiration crossed his face before he could suppress it. "Yes," he said, "it did. They left Calder tied to the carriage wheel with his own belt and a length of harness rope." Theron removed the man's boots to discourage any ambitious ideas about walking to the nearest village and placed them on the roof of the tilted brougham, where they sat like a pair of leather gargoyles watching over the empty road. The draft horses were unhitched and examined. Both were sound, though badly lathered, and still breathing hard from the forced gallop. Theron fashioned simple rope bridles from the harness and led them down the remainder of the coastal highway on foot, with Gwendolen walking beside him and the late afternoon sun breaking through the cloud cover for the first time in 3 days. By evening, the woodland thinned and the road widened into a proper turnpike, with stone milestones marking the distance to the coast. The air changed. The damp moorland chill replaced by something sharper and saltier that carried the faint smell of tar and kelp. Gulls appeared overhead, circling in wide arcs against the gray sky, and the sound of the sea reached them long before the town itself came into view. Oakhaven Bay sat in a natural harbor, formed by 2 chalk headlands that curved toward each other like the arms of a man reaching into the water. The town climbed the hillside behind the harbor in a series of terraced streets, with the docks and warehouses at the bottom and the residential quarters rising above in neat rows of stone-fronted houses with slate roofs. Church spires marked the upper town, and the masts of merchant vessels crowded the harbor below like a forest of stripped trees. They entered through the eastern gate as the lamplighters were beginning their rounds, and the cobblestone streets were busy with the end-of-day traffic of a working port. Dock laborers heading for the alehouses, merchants closing their shop fronts, fishwives carrying empty baskets back from the quayside market. Theron kept his cap low and his collar turned up. In the fading light, among the press of working men and tradespeople, he drew no attention. Gwendolen walked half a step behind him, her traveling cloak gathered tight around her shoulders, looking for all the world like a tired clerk following her employer through an unfamiliar town. They turned off the main commercial street into a narrow lane that ran parallel to the waterfront. Here the buildings were older, timber-framed warehouses with heavy oak doors and small, high windows designed to keep out both weather and thieves. The smell of rope, pitch, and dried saltfish hung in the air between the buildings like an invisible curtain. Theron stopped at the 4th warehouse on the left. It was larger than its neighbors, with a faded painted sign above the door that read, "Harding and Son, Ship Chandlers, Est, 1782. The windows were dark, but a thin line of light showed beneath the main door. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. Footsteps shuffled inside. A bolt was drawn back, and the door opened 6 inches to reveal a weathered face with deep-set eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same chalk as the headlands outside. "Captain Harding," Theron said. The face studied him for a long moment. Then the deep-set eyes widened slightly, and the door swung fully open. "By God," the old man said. Young Theron. Captain Elias Harding was 72 years old, retired from 40 years in the Merchant Navy, and built like a piece of ship's timber that had been soaked in salt water and dried in the sun until it became harder than the original wood. He had served under Theron's father aboard a frigate during the last years of the old Duke's naval career, and the bond between the 2 men had survived retirement, distance, and the old Duke's death 8 years prior. Harding led them inside, without questions. The ground floor of the warehouse was stacked with coils of rope, barrels of tar, and crates of iron fittings, but a staircase at the rear led to a comfortable set of rooms on the upper level where the captain lived alone with a ginger cat and an impressive collection of naval charts pinned to every available wall surface. He sat them down at a heavy pine table, produced a bottle of brandy and 3 tin cups, and waited. Theron laid everything on the table: the ciphered letter, the number strip, the financial draft from the saddlebag, the brass token taken from Calder's neck. He arranged them in order and told the story from the beginning: Lord Vane's arrival, the concealed blade, the escape through the drainage grate, the flight across the moor, the signet ring at the Wayfarer's Rest, and the sabotaged carriage on the coastal highway. Harding listened without interrupting. When Theron finished, the old captain picked up the financial draft and held it close to the oil lamp on the table. Crane and Harwick, he read. Chandler's on Wharf Street. He set the draft down and looked at Theron. I know this firm. They have operated from the same premises for 15 years. Respectable front. Ship supplies, canvas, cordage. But the men who run that office handle more paper than rope, if you follow my meaning. A clearinghouse, Theron said, for funds that prefer not to travel through proper banking channels. Half the gray money on this coast passes through Crane and Harwick at one time or another. The harbor master knows it. The magistrates know it. Nobody touches them because nobody can prove the connection between the front office and the back room. Gwendolyn leaned forward. Could they tell us who commissioned the draft? Who ordered the payment? Harding shook his head. They would sooner set fire to their own premises than open their books to a stranger. But the draft itself might tell you what you need, if you can read it properly. He tapped the document with a thick finger. This paper was drawn on the guild. That means the funds originated inside the guild's own accounts. Someone with signing authority within the Saltcliffe Harbor Merchants Guild authorized £400 to be routed through Crane and Harwick for the purpose of paying an assassin. That is not a clerk's decision. That is a man with power. Theron pulled the ciphered letter toward him and resumed his decode work. With better light and Harding's knowledge of local shipping terminology to guide the substitutions, the remaining blocks began to yield their contents within the hour. Gwendolyn sat beside him, cross-referencing the decoded fragments against the shipping manifests she had memorized from the notebook in the saddlebag. Port names matched, dates aligned, a pattern emerged. A long, careful record of goods shipped from Theron's own estate lands, routed through Saltcliffe, and sold through Oakhaven Bay, at prices that never appeared in the estate's official accounts. By midnight, the full picture lay spread across Captain Harding's pine table, assembled from coded letters, financial drafts, and the quiet, persistent attention of a woman who had been trained since childhood to notice when the numbers told a different story than the one being spoken aloud. Theron sat back in his chair and stared at the decoded letter. His face had gone very still. "What is it?" Gwendolyn asked. He placed one finger on a name at the bottom of the decoded text, a name he recognized. A name that had sat across from him at his own dining table every quarter day for the past 11 years, presenting accounts and assuring the Duke that the estate's finances were in perfect order. "I know who paid for my death," he said. The name on the decoded letter was Master Aldrich Vance. Theron said it aloud only once, and then sat in silence for a long time while the oil lamp flickered on Captain Harding's table and the ginger cat slept undisturbed on a stack of naval charts in the corner. Master Vance had served as chief land steward of the Blackthorn estate for nearly 20 years. He had been appointed by Theron's father during the old Duke's final years, and when the elder Theron passed, Vance had remained in place, a steady, competent presence who managed the tenancies, oversaw the timber operations, and presented the quarterly accounts with the meticulous precision of a man who understood that land was the foundation of everything. Theron had trusted him completely. There had never been a reason not to. The accounts balanced. The tenants paid their rents. The timber yields matched the surveyor's estimates within acceptable margins. Vance attended every quarter-day meeting with leather-bound ledgers that told a clean, orderly story of an estate in good health. The decoded letter told a different story entirely. Gwendolyn spread the translated passages across the table and arranged them beside the financial draft and the shipping manifests she had committed to memory from the saddlebag notebook. Together, the documents revealed an operation that had been running for over a decade. Careful, patient, and almost invisible. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Blackthorn Manor owned extensive timber rights across 3 parishes. Each year, the estate's woodlands produced several hundred loads of oak and elm that were felled, seasoned, and sold through licensed merchants at market price. Master Vance managed the entire process, selecting the timber lots, contracting the felling crews, negotiating the sale prices, and recording the transactions in the estate ledgers. What the ledgers did not show was that Vance had been selling nearly a third of each year's timber through a separate, unrecorded channel. The wood was felled from remote lots on the estate's northern boundary, transported by night to a private landing on the river, and shipped downstream to Saltcliffe, where it entered the Harbor Merchants Guild supply chain under forged bills of lading. From Saltcliffe, it was sold through Oakhaven Bay at full market price, and the proceeds were routed back through Crane and Harwick into accounts that bore no connection to the Blackthorn estate. Over 11 years, the scheme had drained thousands of pounds from the estate without leaving a visible trace in the official books. Vance had achieved this by maintaining 2 sets of accounts: the clean ledgers he presented to the Duke each quarter, and a shadow set that tracked the real volumes and the diverted profits. The coded letter Gwendolyn had found was part of the communication chain between Vance and his contacts in the Saltcliffe Guild, coordinating shipment schedules and payment transfers. 11 years, Theron said quietly. He was still staring at the documents on the table, his hands flat on the pine surface. He has been stealing from me for 11 years. Harding refilled the tin cups with brandy. A man does not run a scheme this size alone. He would need allies inside the guild, cooperation from the river transport operators, and at least one reliable forger to produce the false bills of lading. This is a network. It is the same network that sent Lord Vane to my reception hall, with a blade up his sleeve, Theron said. The question is why now? Vance has been operating successfully for over a decade without detection. Why risk an assassination? Gwendolyn, who had been quietly rereading the decoded passages for the 3rd time, looked up. The annual audit. Theron turned to her. You mentioned it once at the manor. Mrs. Pemberton said the estate undergoes a full independent audit every 5 years, conducted by an outside firm appointed by the County Land Commission. The next one is scheduled for this autumn. The room went quiet. Harding set down his cup. A 5-year audit would examine the original timber surveys against the recorded sales, Gwendolyn continued. If an independent surveyor walked the northern lots and counted the stumps, he would find that far more trees had been felled than the estate ledgers account for. The discrepancy would be enormous. Vance could adjust his own books, but he cannot put trees back in the ground. Theron closed his eyes briefly. So he commissioned my death before the audit could take place. With me gone and the estate in probate, the audit would be delayed, possibly for years, long enough for him to close his accounts, destroy the evidence, and disappear, or install himself as interim estate manager during the probate period, Harding added. A gone duke with no heir leaves a vacuum. The courts would need someone to administer the property until succession was resolved. Who better than the man who has been running it for 20 years? Theron stood and walked to the window. Below, the harbor lay dark and still, the riding lights of anchored vessels reflecting in long, wavering lines across the black water. A night watchman's lantern moved slowly along the quayside, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell struck twice. "I sat across from him every quarter," he said, his back to the room. "Every 3 months for 11 years. He poured my tea. He explained the accounts. He expressed concern about drainage costs and fence repairs and the price of seasoned elm at the Michaelmas market." He paused. "And every time he left my study, he walked back to his office and added another entry to the real ledger." Gwendolen gathered the documents into a neat stack. "We have enough to bring this before a magistrate. The decoded letter, the financial draft, the guild seal, the brass token from the driver. Together they establish a chain, from the assassination attempt back through the Saltcliffe Guild to the estate itself." "The regional magistrates sit at the High Guild Hall in Oakhaven," Harding said. "The annual merchant assembly begins tomorrow morning. Every guild master, trading house factor, and licensed merchant in the county will be present. If you walk in there with this evidence during open session, Vance will have no shadows to hide in." Theron turned from the window. The stillness had left his face, replaced by something harder and more focused. "Vance will be there. He attends the merchant assembly every year as the Blackthorn Estate's representative. He will be sitting in that hall tomorrow, expecting to receive word that his problem has been solved and his duke is gone. Then he is going to have a very unpleasant morning," Gwendolen said. Theron looked at her. A trace of that expression from the reception hall crossed his features, the one that had preceded the first laugh heard at Blackthorn in 11 years. "Miss Marsh," he said, "Your Grace, when we walk into that hall tomorrow, I need you beside me. You found the cipher key, you identified the guild crest, you retrieved the financial draft. You are the only witness who can connect every piece of evidence to the moment it was discovered. Without your testimony, a good solicitor could argue that any of these documents were fabricated." She straightened her shoulders. The oversized traveling cloak had been draped over the back of her chair, and without it, she looked smaller, but somehow more solid, as though the past 5 days had stripped away something unnecessary and left behind only the parts that mattered. "I will be there," she said. Harding stood from the table and stretched his back, with a sound like old timber settling. "Then I suggest you both sleep. The guild hall opens at 9, and you will want to be there before Master Vance has time to hear any rumors from the road." He showed them to separate rooms at the back of the upper floor. Small, clean spaces with narrow cots and wool blankets that smelled of cedar and sea air. Gwendolen fell asleep within minutes of lying down, the exhaustion of 5 days finally pulling her under like a deep, warm tide. Theron sat on the edge of his cot for a long time, the decoded letter in his hands, reading the name at the bottom over and over in the lamplight. Master Aldrich Vance, his most trusted man, his mother's last appointment, the one person he had never thought to suspect. He folded the letter, extinguished the lamp, and lay down in the dark. Tomorrow would settle it, one way or another. The High Guild Hall of Oakhaven Bay was a building designed to remind everyone who entered it that commerce was a serious business. Built from Portland stone, with tall arched windows and a pillared entrance portico, it sat at the top of the market square, like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of trade. Iron lanterns flanked the main doors, and above the entrance a carved stone motto read, "Honor in fair dealing," a sentiment that would have been more convincing if half the men who walked beneath it each year were not quietly engaged in activities that were neither honorable nor fair. The annual merchant assembly drew every licensed trader, guild officer, and estate representative in the county. It was part commercial fair, part regulatory hearing, and part theater, a day when fortunes were displayed, alliances were tested, and disputes were settled under the watchful gaze of 3 regional magistrates who sat on a raised bench at the far end of the main hall. Theron and Gwendolen, arrived at 8:30, 30 minutes before the formal proceedings were scheduled to begin. Captain Harding had provided fresh clothes from his own wardrobe, a dark blue coat and clean linen shirt for Theron, and a plain gray wool dress with a white collar for Gwendolyn, borrowed from the captain's widowed neighbor who asked no questions and accepted a half-crown for the trouble. The clothes were not fashionable, but they were clean, pressed, and respectable enough to pass through the Guildhall doors without drawing comment. Theron carried the evidence in a leather document case that Harding had supplied: the decoded letter, the original ciphered version, the financial draft from the saddlebag, the number strip from the shaving kit, and the brass token taken from the saboteur driver on the coastal highway. Each item was wrapped separately in oilskin and arranged in the order he intended to present them. They entered through a side door that opened onto the gallery level above the main hall. From here, they could see the full chamber below, a wide rectangular space with rows of wooden benches arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central speaking floor. The magistrate's bench occupied the far wall, elevated on a stone platform, with the county arms mounted behind it. To the left, a long table held the guild registers and the official weights and measures. To the right, a smaller table was reserved for petitioners who wished to bring matters before the court. The hall was filling steadily. Merchants in wool coats and polished boots filed through the main doors, greeting colleagues and competitors with the same practiced smile. Guild officers in formal chains of office took their seats near the front. Clerks carried ledgers and document rolls to the registration table, and there, in the third row from the front, sitting with the composed stillness of a man who had attended this assembly every year for 2 decades, was Master Aldrich Vance. Gwendolyn spotted him first. She recognized him from the manor, a lean man in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair, combed flat against his scalp, and a pair of wire-framed spectacles perched on a narrow nose. He wore a dark green coat, of good quality, and his hands rested on a leather portfolio in his lap. He looked exactly like what he had always appeared to be, a diligent, trustworthy estate manager attending to his employer's business interests. "There," she said quietly. Theron followed her gaze, his jaw set, but his expression remained controlled. "We wait until the magistrates are seated and the session is formally opened. A petition entered during open session becomes part of the official court record. He cannot suppress it or claim it was a private matter." They waited on the gallery for another 20 minutes. Below them, the hall continued to fill. A bell rang at 9 o'clock sharp, and the 3 magistrates entered through a door behind the bench, 2 older men in formal black robes and a younger woman carrying a thick volume of county statutes. They took their seats. The hall steward called for order, and the session was declared open. Theron descended the gallery stairs with Gwendolyn 1 step behind him. The effect of his entrance was immediate and total. Heads turned along every row of benches as the tall figure in the blue coat walked down the central aisle toward the petitioner's table. Whispers rippled through the assembly like wind across a wheat field. The Duke of Theron had not attended the merchant assembly in over a decade, and his sudden appearance in a borrowed coat with a young woman nobody recognized at his side was the kind of event that would fuel local gossip for months. Master Vance saw him from the 3rd row. The blood drained from his face in a slow, visible tide, starting at his forehead and moving downward until his entire complexion matched the gray of his hair. His hands tightened on the leather portfolio, and his eyes darted once toward the side exit on the left wall of the hall. Theron reached the petitioner's table and addressed the magistrates directly. "Your Honors, I am the Duke of Theron, Lord of the Blackthorn Estate. I am here to present evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving embezzlement, fraud, and a commissioned attempt on my life. I request that this matter be heard in open session and entered into the permanent court record. The Chief Magistrate, a heavy-set man with white side whiskers and the measured demeanor of someone who had heard a great many extraordinary claims in his career, leaned forward and studied Theron for a moment. The court recognizes the Duke of Theron. You may proceed. Theron opened the document case and began. He presented the evidence in sequence, each piece building on the last. The ciphered letter recovered from Lord Vane's coat. The number strip that served as the cipher key, found by Gwendolen in the assassin's shaving kit. The decoded translation revealing financial instructions routed through the Saltcliffe Harbor Merchants Guild. The financial draft authorizing £400 payable through Crane and Harwick upon confirmed completion of the assassination. The brass guild token recovered from the saboteur driver on the coastal highway. And finally, the decoded name at the bottom of the letter, Master Aldrich Vance, Chief Land Steward of the Blackthorn Estate, the man who had been systematically selling the estate's timber through forged bills of lading for over 11 years, and who had commissioned the Duke's finishing to prevent discovery during the upcoming independent audit. The hall was completely silent. Every face in the chamber had turned toward the third row, where Master Vance sat rigid on his bench, his knuckles white around the leather portfolio. The Chief Magistrate looked from the documents to Vance. Master Vance, you are named in this petition. Do you wish to respond? Vance stood. His spectacles had slid halfway down his nose, and he pushed them back with a trembling finger. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked toward the side exit. He moved fast for a man of 58. He was out of his bench and across the aisle in 3 strides, heading for the arched doorway that led to the rear corridor. Several merchants stumbled aside as he pushed between them. A clerk dropped a ledger. The hall steward shouted for order. Gwendolen had been standing 2 feet from the side aisle. She did not try to grab him. She did not step in front of him. What she did was shift her weight at exactly the wrong moment, placing her right foot squarely on the trailing hem of Vance's long wool overcoat as he swept past her. The coat pulled taut like a leash. Vance's forward momentum carried his upper body ahead, while his shoulders snapped backward. His feet tangled, his arms windmilled, and he pitched forward headfirst into a display table near the exit that held a set of ceremonial brass weighing scales used for the annual grain inspection. The crash was spectacular. Scales, brass weights, and a wooden measuring rod scattered across the stone floor with a clattering racket that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Vance lay face down amid the wreckage, his spectacles broken, his coat still pinned beneath Gwendolen's boot. She looked down at him, then at the magistrates, then at Theron. "I am terribly sorry," she said. "I seem to have been standing on his coat." The bailiffs were there within seconds, hauling Vance upright and securing his wrists behind his back. The chief magistrate instructed the court clerk to enter a formal arrest into the record. The hall erupted into the kind of noise that only occurs when 200 merchants simultaneously realize they have witnessed something they will be talking about for the rest of their lives. Theron stood at the petitioner's table, watching the bailiffs lead Vance toward the holding chamber behind the magistrate's bench. The steward was still calling for order. Gwendolen was still standing on the edge of the wool coat, which had torn free from Vance's shoulders during the fall, and now lay crumpled beneath her foot like a defeated flag. She stepped off it carefully, smoothed the front of her borrowed gray dress, and walked back to stand beside the Duke. He looked at her. "You stepped on his coat." "It was an accident, Your Grace." "Of course it was." She met his gaze steadily. The faintest trace of color had risen in her cheeks, and there was something in her expression that suggested the accident had been the most precisely timed accident in the history of the Oakhaven Bay Merchant Assembly. Theron turned back to the magistrates to complete his formal deposition, and if anyone in the front rows noticed the small, involuntary smile that crossed his face as he did so, they had the good sense not to mention it. The journey back to Blackthorn Manor took 2 days. Theron hired a proper carriage this time, one with a driver whose credentials Captain Harding personally verified, and whose neck bore no brass tokens of any kind. The coastal highway was clear, the weather had turned mild, and the draft horses maintained a steady, unhurried pace that suited a journey with no one chasing them for the first time in a week. Gwendolen slept for most of the first day. She curled into the corner of the carriage bench with the traveling cloak folded beneath her head, and did not stir when they stopped to change horses at a posting inn or when the driver called down to announce they had crossed the county line. Her body had finally accepted that the crisis was over, and it collected its debts with interest. Theron spent the hours reviewing the formal documents the magistrates had provided. Master Vance had been remanded to the county jail, pending a full trial at the quarterly assizes. The Saltcliffe Harbor Merchants Guild had been served notice of investigation, and 3 of its senior officers had been summoned to give testimony regarding the forged bills of lading and the financial drafts routed through Crane and Harwick. The chandler's office on Wharf Street had been sealed by the harbor master's men on the morning after the Guildhall proceedings, its books impounded and its 2 proprietors taken into custody. The network was collapsing. Each arrest produced names, and each name led to another thread in the web that Vance had spent 11 years spinning. The magistrates estimated that the full accounting would take months, but the preliminary figures suggested that the embezzlement totaled well over £12,000, a sum large enough to have purchased a modest country estate outright. £12,000 stolen from beneath the nose of a man who had believed his house was in order. Theron read the figure 3 times, and then folded the document and placed it inside his coat without expression. There would be time to feel the full weight of that betrayal later. For now, there were practical matters to attend to. They reached the edge of the Blackthorn lands on the afternoon of the 2nd day. The moor looked different in daylight and fair weather, wide and green, with purple heather beginning to bloom along the ridgelines, and larks rising from the bracken in sudden vertical bursts of song. The ravine where Gwendolen's horse had thrown a shoe was just a shallow dip in the landscape now, and the crumbling monastery archway where Theron had strung his cloak as a barricade looked peaceful and small against the open sky. Gwendolen woke as the carriage turned onto the private road that led to the manor gates. She sat up, pushed her hair from her face, and looked out the window at the familiar gray stone walls and the square tower rising above the elm trees. "We are home," she said, and then caught herself, as though the word had slipped out before she could evaluate whether she was entitled to use it. Theron glanced at her, but said nothing. The gates stood open. Holt the stable-master was waiting in the courtyard with 2 grooms and a look of profound relief that he attempted to disguise as professional composure. Mrs. Pemberton appeared at the front door before the carriage had fully stopped, her ring of brass keys clutched in one hand, and her posture suggesting she had been standing in that exact position at regular intervals for the past 6 days. "Your Grace," she said, as Theron stepped down from the carriage. Her voice carried the particular tone of a woman who had a great deal to say and was exercising considerable discipline in not saying all of it at once. "Mrs. Pemberton, I trust the manor survived." "The manor is intact, Your Grace. The riders who arrived on the night of your departure circled the grounds for 2 hours and then left. They have not returned." She paused. "The reception hall rug has been cleaned. The teapot was recovered from beneath a side table. It is dented, but functional. Much like the rest of us," Theron said. He spent the remainder of the afternoon in his study, writing letters to the County Land Commission, the independent auditors, and his solicitor in the nearest city. Each letter contained a summary of the evidence, a request for formal proceedings against the Saltcliffe Guild members, and instructions for the appointment of a new chief land steward to begin the work of reconciling 11 years of falsified accounts. The last letter was the hardest. It was addressed to the firm that had originally appointed Master Vance, the same firm his father had used, and it contained a single paragraph requesting that all future appointments to the estate's senior staff be subject to independent verification. He signed it, sealed it, and set it aside with the heaviness of a man closing a door he had walked through many times without knowing what lay on the other side of it. At sunset, Theron walked out onto the grand stone terrace that overlooked the rear courtyard and the gardens beyond. The sky was turning gold and copper above the tree line, and the air carried the sweet, green smell of cut grass from the lower lawns where the groundsman had been working in his absence. A blackbird sang from the top of the garden wall with the confident volume of a creature that considered the entire estate its personal stage. Gwendolen found him there 10 minutes later. She had changed into a clean uniform, her own this time properly fitted, and her hair was pinned back in the neat arrangement that Mrs. Pemberton required of all household staff. She looked more like the girl who had walked into Blackthorn 9 weeks ago than the woman who had crawled through stable yards and jammed brass lamps into steering assemblies on the coastal highway. She stood beside him at the terrace railing and waited. "I have been thinking about your position in this household," Theron said, looking out over the courtyard. "I understand, Your Grace. I realize that my conduct over the past week has been somewhat outside the expected duties of a housemaid. Somewhat outside." He turned to face her. "Miss Marsh, you identified a concealed weapon with a teapot. You decoded a cipher key from a shaving kit. You infiltrated a stable yard and recovered a financial draft worth £400. You disabled a sabotaged carriage with a lamp, and you apprehended a fleeing criminal with your foot." He paused. "I do not think housemaid is the correct title for you." He reached into his coat and produced a folded letter bearing his personal seal. "Effective immediately, I am appointing you Head Estate Auditor of the Blackthorn lands. You will have full access to the accounts, the timber records, and every document in the estate office. Your salary will reflect the position." Gwendolen took the letter. Her hands were steady, but her eyes had gone very bright, and she blinked several times in quick succession while studying the seal as though it required intense examination. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I will do my best to ensure that no one steals from you again. I have every confidence in that." She broke the seal and opened the letter to read the formal terms of appointment. As she did, the brass feather pen she had tucked behind her ear, borrowed from the study desk on her way through the corridor, slipped free, bounced off the stone railing, and dropped in a graceful arc into the courtyard fountain below, where it landed with a small, bright splash that sent a ring of ripples across the still water. Gwendolen closed her eyes. "I will fish that out immediately." "Leave it," Theron said. She looked at him. He was smiling. It was a real smile, not the sudden, startled laugh of a man caught off guard by a flying teapot, but something quieter and warmer, the kind of expression that takes up permanent residence on a face that has been without one for far too long. The blackbird on the garden wall sang its final phrase of the evening and dropped into the hedge. The fountain rippled gently around the sunken pen. The last of the sunlight caught the gold lettering on the appointment letter in Gwendolen's hands, and for the first time in 11 years, Blackthorn Manor felt like a place where someone might actually want to stay.